Welcome to the Deep and Durable Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Gray, a veteran of nearly 45 years in higher education. My goal has always been to transmit my love of learning to as many people as possible, and this podcast is one vehicle to do that. In my teaching career, I taught biology to over 10,000 students. Many of them remarked that I taught them how to think. This podcast aims to do the same for my listeners. Join me for Season 5, which will develop your ability to ask the kinds of questions that lead to deep and durable learning. Nothing is more powerful in learning than curiosity. Curiosity inevitably generates questions. Pursuing the answers to questions leads to understanding. And understanding is what makes learning deep as well as durable. Today's podcast will work on the question we generated in the previous podcast, and that is, why is it pollution when we burn fossilized organisms and release CO2, and yet living organisms which constantly release CO2 are not a problem? There's a lot of bluster about the certainty of climate science these days. Thinking through this focus question is one way to find out what we really know for sure and where ambiguity is reality. I'm not really taking sides in the ongoing debate, at least at this point, just asking a probing question. It is important to really care when we formulate questions. Maybe you've avoided thinking about this issue so far, but the size of one's carbon footprint has become something of a moral litmus test these days. Advocates claim a scientific mandate for change with existential consequences if we don't prioritize massive reductions in our carbon footprint. To achieve these reductions will require extraordinary lifestyle changes, including vegetarianism, riding your bike or possibly taking public transportation, and emphasizing utility in your clothing rather than fashion. Columbia University lists 35 things you can do to reduce your carbon footprint, and it includes the items I just mentioned. The EPA has an online carbon footprint calculator if you want to check your footprint. I link to both of these in the accompanying blog post at deepanddurable.com. Rhetorician James Crosswhite, in his excellent book, The Rhetoric of Reason, made an interesting observation about asking questions that grab us. He talks about claims that make a claim on us. Here's a brief snippet from his book. Quote, "People will not learn to hear claims, and thus will not comprehend the relation between claims and reasons for claims, will not understand arguments as arguments, unless they can ask the questions that allow claims to appear as claims." End of quote. Crosswhite argues that we must view a claim as questionable. By questionable, he does not mean that we are necessarily skeptical. Rather, we take the claim seriously enough that it is worthy of asking questions about the claim, and, through argument, bring evidence and logic to bear on it. That's what we're doing with our focus question. We've previously recognized divergent, convergent, and metacognitive questions. Formulating the focus question was primarily divergent questioning in order to generate a question about the carbon cycle that's worthy of our cognitive investment in today's podcast. Today, we'll be dealing with a combination of convergent questioning and metacognitive questioning. Convergent questioning is aimed at asking questions that will enable us to converge on an answer. Before we can arrive at an answer, we'll need to invoke evidence and logic using metacognitive questioning primarily. Metacognition involves thinking about our thinking. Here, it will show up by the kind of questions we ask. Our questions will deal with the three aspects of the working layer: questions about our assumptions, questions about facts that are relevant to the focus question, and questions about the ideas, that is, the concepts, that form the basis for logical engagement with the question. Along the way, we may need to ask questions of clarification when our metacognition signals that we are fuzzy. We don't really understand. Let's start with the assumptions we will need to make. Acknowledging assumptions is necessary for clear thinking. We all make assumptions because our thinking must start somewhere. We make assumptions about things that are outside our expertise, which we accept at face value, at least to begin with. Even within our expertise, there are things we accept without proof. As a scientist, an example would be to assume the first law of thermodynamics. Matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed, but they can be interconverted. This law is solid. It is as close to proven as is possible in science. Assumptions can be questioned, however. Sometimes others in a conversation may say something on the order of, you seem to be assuming blank. Would you acknowledge that? This might be followed by, why do you think that's a legitimate assumption? A relevant example with the focus question on CO2 levels would be the worldview assumption from one group that the Earth is billions of years old and that CO2 levels have been balanced for millions of years, assuming uniformitarian principles. On this basis, most secular scientists also assume that they have access to reliable information about the pre-human past of our planet. On the other side is the assumption based on inferences drawn from Scripture that the Earth is young and that catastrophes, especially the worldwide flood in Noah's time, have substantially altered Earth's ecosystems. Catastrophism denies that the present is the key to the past. Regardless of where you position yourself, I believe you can generate questions about the assumptions that are being made here. Here's another question. Why is it a legitimate assumption that global scale phenomena can be explained by extrapolation of local ecosystem level causes and effects? That is certainly an assumption that climate scientists make. Here's one final question about assumptions. Most everyone, scientist and layperson alike, would answer yes to this question. Is it always desirable that organic compounds be biodegradable? This question will prove to be relevant later in our discussion. One limited expression of this is that every naturally occurring organic compound is food for some living organism, which will break it down in order to stay alive. On this basis, we can expect that oil spills will eventually be degraded by microorganisms, and the ecology of the spill area will return to at least some semblance of its original condition. We reason primarily within our conceptual frameworks. Many people trip over the use of the label concept. A concept is a perceived pattern, a regularity. By constructing concepts, we simplify multiple occurrences into powerful ideas that are flexible and extensible to a variety of contexts. As a simple example, let's take war. War involves hostility between adversaries that precipitates taking actions to harm the adversary. It may involve armed conflict, but it might be a cyber attack. There are entire war colleges which study the history of wars, the prevention of wars, the justification of wars, and the conduct of wars. There's much to think about, but beneath it all, there is the singular concept, the idea of war. Let's reconsider our focus question. Why is it pollution when we burn fossilized organisms and release CO2, and yet living organisms which constantly release CO2 are not a problem? Two main concepts emerge as we chew on this: cycling and sequestering. The carbon cycle is the mechanism by which we expect that CO2 will be kept at a constant and acceptable level. Part of the way that the cycle keeps carbon dioxide levels constant is through sequestration. Let's try to get closer to an answer by asking conceptual questions. The focus question uses the phrase release CO2 twice. Here are a few questions that come to mind. What processes release CO2? And what processes produce substances from which CO2 can be released? These questions are necessitated by the concept of a cycle. Cycles repeat over and over. Answering these two questions, we come up with the three major types of organisms that are responsible for cycling carbon. Producers capture CO2 and use it to manufacture, that is, produce, various organic molecules. Consumers and decomposers both use those organic molecules as fuel and release CO2 as a waste product. But what about sequestration? To sequester is an alternative to the merry-go-round concept of a cycle. It's an opt-out situation. That suggests these questions. How can organic molecules be sequestered? Can CO2 be sequestered? Is sequestration reversible? Is sequestration regulated? How is sequestration related to biodegradability? When we start to answer these questions, we're entering the third aspect of the working layer, and that's the realm of facts. I'll deal later with questions about facts, but grappling with conceptual questions necessitates at least a few basic factual answers that have already been offered. We can question those answers later, and we will. The total carbon on planet Earth is constant, as recognized in the first law of thermodynamics. Carbon cycle aims to keep carbon dioxide levels constant. However, when organic molecules are not degraded, that is, broken down by metabolism, to produce CO2, they are sequestered, and the carbon they contain is effectively removed from the carbon cycle. This would lower CO2 levels over time. It's what happened in the past when living organisms were fossilized to produce fossil fuel deposits deep in the earth. Their organic biomass was effectively removed from the carbon cycle. Sequestration is also what happens when producers create biomass and in the process create more cells and more offspring. For as long as they are alive, their organic biomass is maintained and is not converted into CO2. If producers like green plants are eaten by other organisms, which we call consumers, such as humans or animals, plant biomass is converted into human or animal biomass. Upon the death of living organisms of all types, decomposers convert organic biomass into CO2. Thus, the greater the population of living organisms, the greater the amount of sequestered carbon. This raises another question. Since living organisms continually use organic molecules as fuel to stay alive, doesn't this constantly release CO2? The answer, of course, is yes. And the longer an organism lives, the more CO2 release predominates over the amount of sequestered carbon in their biomass. This means longer living organisms have a bigger carbon footprint. Within these concepts, we can now ask this question: what made the organic biomass of fossilized organisms stable and not susceptible to decomposition into CO2? The answer is that the process of fossilization, involving heat and pressure, transformed their chemical makeup into much more stable organic compounds through a process called diagenesis. These same conditions also may have sterilized the immediate environment where the fossils were formed so that decomposition couldn't touch them. I'll conclude by considering a few facts which are pertinent to the focus question. Facts are the result of someone's previous thinking, employing the core, working, and output layers. Because of this personal dimension, I don't think brute, uninterpreted facts exist. Facts need to be respected and viewed as highly probable, but not idolized as absolute. Most facts represent truth, but there may be exceptions where the truth doesn't apply for various reasons. There's frequently a collision between a scientific hypothesis and stubborn facts. This is sometimes noted by the wry humor of this statement: the tragedy of science, a beautiful hypothesis slain by an ugly fact. Even when science and facts appear to agree, reigning scientific paradigms appear to be secure until they aren't, as Thomas Kuhn points out in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It starts when new and different questions are asked. These questions suggest new experiments. When experiments are done that produce solid evidence that falsify the current dogma, there's first a period of ad hoc theory patching until there are more patches than theory. This patching period continues until someone advances a hypothesis that explains the experimental results, including the so-called anomalies. Once an alternative hypothesis gains adherence, the old dogma falls hard and fast. I confess that in preparing this podcast, I spent a fascinating 45 minutes sparring with ChatGPT over some inconvenient facts related to the focus question on CO2 emissions. If you want to see our full quote-unquote conversation, you can go to the blog post that accompanies this podcast episode. You'll find it at deepanddurable.com. ChatGPT regularly offered up as unassailable fact the same truisms that you read in the popular news media or hear on television. When challenged with facts that didn't support the popular narrative, ChatGPT slowed down substantially, and its output, initially almost instantaneous, appeared word by word on the screen. At one juncture, as ChatGPT was backing itself into a corner and edging toward contradiction of what it had said earlier, the response on screen turned red and froze uncompleted. To get the response going again, I had to click on a button that would regenerate the conversation. It then proceeded to take a different, more generic tack in answering my query. Unfortunately, the red screen response disappeared and isn't part of the file you'll see in my blog post. The ChatGPT quote-unquote discussion covered more details than we'll have time for in this podcast, but its failure to fully answer questions, as well as its factual errors, is instructive. Let's examine a few established facts that are inconvenient for the standard narrative regarding the sources of rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere. In the standard narrative, carbon dioxide is, quote, emitted, unquote, by humans and animals, but captured by green plants as part of photosynthesis. The truth is that nearly all life forms release CO2. The main exceptions are bacteria and other prokaryotic life forms that ferment organic molecules. Fermentation occurs when the waste products of metabolism are themselves organic. The production of lactic acid and other organic acids in cheese making is one example of fermentation. The alcoholic fermentation itself produces both ethyl alcohol, which is organic, and CO2, which is responsible for the bubbles in the brew. Reality is much more complicated than plants are the good guys and animals are the bad guys. It's necessary to ask the appropriate questions that unearth the truth. I wish we had the time to articulate what follows in the form of questions, but I'm getting close to my time limit for this podcast. You can see some of my questions in the Chat GPT document at my blog. You can also infer the questions I'm asking from the facts I marshal, a la Jeopardy. Plants take up CO2 from the atmosphere, and they use this source of carbon along with light energy to produce all the organic molecules that make up plant cells. Some of these organic molecules are used as fuel. Fuel molecules are dismantled to release their energy in the mitochondria found in the same plant cells. The waste products from this breakdown are water and CO2. CO2 is preferentially captured by the chloroplasts of the same cell. During daylight, with adequate moisture and favorable temperatures, photosynthesis captures enough CO2 to cause cell growth and eventually cell division, which causes the plant itself to grow. Only a fraction of the CO2 captured ends up as fuel. Most of it ends up as biomass that enables growth when conditions are favorable. Most of the CO2 is used to make the DNA, protein, carbohydrates, and lipids, out of which bigger cells and more cells will be constructed. It's a different story when conditions are not favorable for photosynthesis. This is true when it's dark and photosynthesis is impossible. It is also true when other conditions are unfavorable for growth. Under these conditions, cellular respiration breaks down organic food molecules and CO2 is released into the air, just as in animal cells. Plants are not the only players in the CO2 capture game. Bacteria engage in several distinct types of photosynthesis. In addition, a group of microbes called archaea capture CO2, but use inorganic chemical energy rather than light energy to make their own organic molecules. When I asked Chat GPT about the contribution of bacteria to CO2 uptake, things got really slow, and the AI engine mischaracterized their contribution. Prokaryotic cells, including bacteria and archaea, are indeed very small, but their collective biomass is at least as great as all the plants and animals on Earth combined. The marine cyanobacteria Prochlorococcus marinus is, quote, arguably the most abundant photosynthetic organism on our planet, end of quote. It was first discovered in 1986. Prokaryote metabolism is significantly more efficient than plants and animals, contra ChatGPT, enabling them to grow and multiply much more rapidly than plants or animals. Their contribution to the global cycling of carbon is left out because they're extraordinarily diverse and mostly undiscovered or uncharacterized. Out of an estimated 10 million species of prokaryotes, only perhaps 10,000 or so have been studied in any detail. This microbial ignorance has gotten ecologists in trouble in the past. I asked ChatGPT about the problems uncovered in a project called Biosphere 2 that launched in the 1990s. Biosphere 2 was created as a very large, 3.14-acre, sealed environment with 7 interacting biomes inhabited by plants, animals, and 8 humans. Biosphere 2 was meant to be fully self-sustaining, as if it were isolated from the Earth. The inventors termed the Earth itself Biosphere 1. In the first mission, Biosphere 2 oxygen levels dropped dangerously over 16 months to levels like living at about 13,400 feet. Microbes in the rich soil apparently consume far more oxygen than anticipated. Here's one account of the first Biosphere 2 mission, quoting, "Managing CO2 levels was a particular challenge and a source of controversy regarding the Biosphere 2 project's alleged misrepresentation to the public. Daily fluctuation of carbon dioxide dynamics was typically 600 parts per million because of the strong drawdown during daylight hours by plant photosynthesis, followed by a similar rise during the nighttime when system respiration dominated. As expected, there was also a strong seasonal signature to CO2 levels, with wintertime levels as high as 4,000 to 4,500 parts per million, and summertime levels near 1,000 parts per million. CO2 levels in the Earth's atmosphere, on the other hand, the Earth's atmosphere were 420 parts per million in February 2023, up from about 317 parts per million in 1960. Efforts in Biosphere 2 to rebalance the ecosystems were unsuccessful, and scientists had to bootleg in oxygen and artificially scrub CO2 to keep from endangering its human inhabitants. Indeed, most of the vertebrate animals in Biosphere 2 perished in the initial experiments from 1991 to 1993. One more attempt at operating Biosphere 2 as a closed system in 1994 also failed to achieve its objectives. Biosphere 2 is no longer operated as a closed system, but it is still used to investigate large-scale model biomes. Scientific American titled a 2021 article, "Biosphere 2, the once infamous live-in terrarium, is transforming climate research." If we can't manage an artificial, highly controlled environment in Biosphere 2, and the global Earth operates on the same principles, it follows that we can't manage global phenomena. Whether we need to be involved in management and what actions might be most salutary is the topic for the final episode of this season's podcast. Join me in 2 weeks as we move our focus question into the output layer of thinking and develop an answer, as well as determine appropriate actions.